John Denver was the golden boy of folk music, the smiling, soft-spoken voice behind Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Rocky Mountain High. His music felt like freedom, open skies, quiet roads, and a world that still made sense. But behind that sunshine image was a shadow no one saw coming. In 1997, Denver's plane plunged into the Pacific Ocean. No distress call, no warning, just an explosion on impact. The official story was quick. Pilot error, low fuel, and a poorly positioned valve. Case closed. But nearly 3 decades later, that story no longer holds up. New evidence, quiet settlements, and resurfaced warnings suggest that what really happened might have been far worse and far more preventable. Some believe Denver knew the plane was dangerous. Others think the crash was the result of a design flaw no one wanted to admit. And now, viral investigations are bringing the questions back to the surface, louder than ever. Was this really just a tragic accident? Or was there something or someone responsible for the death of a man the world trusted? This is the part of John Denver's story you were never supposed to hear. And once you do, you'll never listen to his music the same way again. Before the tragedy, before the headlines and conspiracy theories, John Denver was something rare. A celebrity people actually believed in. He wasn't just a singer. He was a symbol of hope, simplicity, and unshakable sincerity in a world that was rapidly growing louder and more cynical. His music painted wide-open skies, rivers that never stopped flowing, and love that was tender but real. Leaving on a jet plane, Annie's song, Sunshine on My Shoulders, Take Me Home, Country Roads. These weren't just chart toppers. They were generational hymns, songs people played at weddings, funerals, road trips, and in quiet moments when they just needed to feel something true. But John Denver's image went beyond his voice. He stood for something deeper, something rare in celebrity culture. He was the poster child for nature lovers, dreamers, and idealists. He didn't chase trends or tabloid headlines. Instead, he lent his voice to causes: environmental protection, wildlife conservation, even space exploration. He co-founded the Windstar Foundation, dedicated to ecological sustainability. He met with U.S. presidents and international leaders to push for environmental reform, decades before climate change became a mainstream talking point. He was one of the first Western musicians allowed to tour the Soviet Union, using music as a bridge between political enemies. And he did it all without ego. No scandals, no fame chasing, just passion. To millions, he felt real, grounded, honest, like someone who never let fame change him. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and flannel shirts, stayed out of Hollywood drama, and seemed perfectly content in a cabin tucked in the Rocky Mountains. That persona, part gentle philosopher, part folk hero, made people trust him, believe in him. So when the news broke that he'd died in a plane crash, it felt like more than just a celebrity death. It felt personal. This wasn't a rock star spiraling out of control. It wasn't some scandal-ridden icon meeting an inevitable end. This was John Denver, the one guy who seemed untouchable by darkness. His death didn't feel like fate. It felt wrong, like a mistake that should never have happened. And that's exactly where the questions began. How could someone so careful, so connected to nature and life, die in such a violent, chaotic way? Why was he flying alone in a risky experimental aircraft? And if he did know the risks, why did he take them? The man who once sang, "Life is old there, older than the trees," had suddenly become part of a story that was dark, fast, and full of unknowns. And just like that, the perfect image started to fracture. It was a picture-perfect afternoon along the California coast. The sun hung low over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the runway at Monterey Peninsula Airport. There were no storms on the radar, no turbulence in the air. It was the kind of calm day pilots love. John Denver had recently acquired a Long EZ, a sleek, lightweight aircraft designed by aviation innovator Burt Rutan. The plane was known for its efficiency, its futuristic shape, and its popularity in the experimental aviation community. But it was also known for one other thing. It wasn't user-friendly for just anyone. Its controls were unorthodox. Its fuel system was complicated, and its quirks weren't always forgiving. Denver had only logged a handful of hours in the cockpit. Still, flying was one of his passions. He'd held a pilot's license since the 1970s and owned multiple planes throughout his life. To him, the sky was more than a place of travel. It was freedom. That Sunday, October 12, 1997, he took off for what should have been a routine local flight. Witnesses described the takeoff as smooth. The aircraft climbed gracefully. There was no sign of trouble, no stalling, no radio distress. Then, just minutes into the flight, the long EZ sharply veered and dropped nose first into the ocean near Pacific Grove. The plane exploded on impact. There was no time to react, no call for help, just a flash in the sky. And then nothing but smoke, silence, and saltwater. News of the crash spread like wildfire. By evening, headlines across America read, "John Denver killed in plane crash." Fans wept. Radio stations played his songs on loop. Tributes poured in from musicians, politicians, and everyday people who had grown up with his voice in their homes. But grief quickly gave way to confusion. Why was someone of Denver's stature, a household name, a millionaire, flying alone in a complex home-built aircraft with known quirks? Why didn't he send out a mayday call? And most unsettling of all, how could a man with thousands of flight hours just fall from the sky on a perfect day? The long EZ wasn't like a commercial plane. It had its own rules, its own handling. It didn't even have standard fuel tank controls. Everything about this plane required precision and familiarity. Two things Denver may not have fully had yet. Speculation kicked into overdrive. Was it mechanical failure? Did he run out of fuel? Was there something wrong with the way the plane had been maintained? The questions multiplied and the pressure on investigators mounted. One aviation expert noted that in the experimental aircraft community, accidents often came down to the same few issues: fuel mismanagement, unfamiliar cockpit layouts, and minor oversights that became deadly in seconds. It was a reminder that flying, especially in a plane like the Long EZ, wasn't just a hobby. It was a high-stakes activity that left no room for error. And in John Denver's case, that room may have run out faster than anyone imagined. But the deeper investigators looked, the more troubling and bizarre the story became. When the National Transportation Safety Board finally released its official report, the findings were technical, dry, and strangely unsatisfying. According to investigators, the crash was caused by a deadly mix of human error and mechanical oversight. In their words, it was a tragic but preventable accident. The report highlighted two key factors. First, fuel exhaustion. Denver had taken off without refueling the aircraft. The Long EZ had two separate fuel tanks, one on each side of the aircraft, and only one had been partially filled. The second factor was even more damning: a poorly positioned fuel selector valve. In most planes, switching fuel tanks is simple, a switch or knob within easy reach. But in the Long EZ, the valve was mounted behind the pilot's left shoulder. To access it mid-flight, the pilot had to twist around awkwardly, removing at least one hand from the controls. Denver, investigators noted, was not familiar with this design. He had expressed discomfort with the layout before, but despite that, no modifications had been made. So what likely happened? According to the NTSB, Denver's plane ran out of fuel in the active tank mid-flight. As the engine sputtered, he may have attempted to reach back and switch to the other tank. In doing so, he lost control, and within seconds, the aircraft spiraled into a fatal dive. That alone is chilling enough, but it wasn't the only red flag. The report revealed that the plane lacked several key safety upgrades that had been recommended in the years prior. These weren't minor tweaks. They included changes to the fuel system and cockpit layout that could have made flying the Long EZ far safer, especially for new pilots. Why those changes hadn't been made remains unclear to this day. Then came the darker whispers. Rumors started to swirl that Denver had been careless, or worse, that he'd been drinking or using substances. But when the toxicology report came back, it shut those theories down cold. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing in his system that could have impaired him. He was completely sober, focused, in control, at least until the moment everything went wrong. So if it wasn't intoxication, and if it wasn't weather, and if the man was a seasoned pilot, then what really happened? Why was he allowed to fly a complex aircraft with such a flawed design? Why weren't the safety recommendations enforced? Some pointed to simple human error. Others saw something more systemic. An industry that often pushes responsibility onto the pilot while avoiding deeper scrutiny of aircraft design flaws. The idea that a man like Denver, who had always preached safety, responsibility, and care, could die from something so basic as a fuel valve. It just didn't sit right with a lot of people. And for those who knew him personally or studied the case closely, the official story started to feel less like a clear conclusion and more like a convenient one. Because if the fault didn't lie solely with John Denver, then maybe someone else should have been held accountable. And that's exactly what his family set out to do next. John Denver's family wasn't convinced. The official narrative sounded clinical, almost too clean, blaming a man they knew to be meticulous, disciplined, and passionate about flying. They didn't see recklessness. They saw negligence, but not from him, so they pushed back. Not long after the crash, Denver's estate filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the manufacturer of the plane's fuel selector valve. The core of their claim was devastatingly simple. The design of that valve and its impossible placement behind the pilot's shoulder was a disaster waiting to happen. According to the legal filing, the valve's positioning and operation required an unreasonable and unsafe maneuver in flight, especially for anyone unfamiliar with the aircraft's customized configuration. It was a trap, one that didn't just rely on the pilot's awareness, but on their physical flexibility mid-air. A design that forced someone to let go of the controls just to reach life-critical systems. Imagine it. You're flying solo. Your engine suddenly sputters. You realize one tank is empty, and the only way to fix it is to twist your entire upper body backward, blindly, while trying not to lose control of a speeding, lightweight aircraft. 1 second too slow, one twitch too hard, and it's over. That's the scenario Denver's family painted in court, but they didn't get the public reckoning they hoped for. The lawsuit never made it to trial. It was settled quietly, behind closed doors, with no official admission of fault. The manufacturer walked away without public blame. The Denver family received a settlement, but no apology, no clear answers, and no systemic change. And that silence, that sudden end, for many, it said more than any ruling could. Why settle if the part wasn't at fault? Why not let the courts determine accountability? If the company truly believed the valve was safe, wouldn't they fight to prove it? To some, the settlement was understandable, a way to avoid dragging a grieving family through months, maybe years, of painful litigation. But to others, it looked like a strategic cover-up, a way to bury potential liability before the case reached a jury, or before damning evidence became part of the public record. And that's where the theories started to multiply. Online community, pilots, engineers, legal analysts began to pull the case apart. YouTube creators dug into the lawsuit filings. Aviation forums speculated on what might have been discussed during those settlement meetings. Some pointed out that similar valve designs had been criticized in other accidents. Others noted that the Long EZ community had raised warnings for years about the cockpit layout. Still, no one spoke on the record. No whistleblowers, no court documents beyond the initial filings. Just questions and silence. But as anyone familiar with the internet knows, silence doesn't kill a mystery. It feeds it. And in the vacuum left by that private settlement, a new wave of speculation began to take hold, one that would go far beyond fuel valves or cockpit design and into something much harder to explain. For years, the official story sat quietly, preserved in reports, quoted in articles, and whispered about by fans who didn't want to question too much. It was easier that way, cleaner, safer. But time has a way of digging up what's been buried. Nearly 2 decades after John Denver's death, something strange began happening. A wave of YouTube exposés, podcast episodes, and independent blog investigations started popping up online. Many were made by aviation enthusiasts and amateur sleuths. Others came from independent journalists who had begun re-examining old celebrity deaths that never sat right. And Denver's crash? It was near the top of the list. Titles like The John Denver Crash Cover-Up, Fuel Valve Fatal Flaw Exposed, and Denver Knew the Plane Was Dangerous started gaining traction, some racking up hundreds of thousands of views. What they had in common was simple. They all pointed out how much was left out of the official narrative. One clip dug into archived radio interviews where Denver allegedly voiced concerns about the aircraft's fuel system. Another analyzed FAA maintenance records showing delayed or undocumented modifications made to the plane just weeks before the fatal flight. There were claims that essential logbooks had missing pages or had never been properly updated after Denver took ownership. The theory that drew the most attention? That the fuel system had an undocumented flaw, a defect that some builders in the experimental aircraft community had been quietly warning each other about for years. Not officially, not in manuals, but in word-of-mouth conversations, private forums, and builder circles. Some Long EZ owners even stepped forward anonymously, claiming they'd experienced similar issues, including difficulty reaching the selector valve. sudden power loss when switching tanks, and even in-flight stalls due to improper weight distribution. And yet, none of this ever made it into FAA recalls. None of it was addressed in the NTSB's final report. Then came the darker whispers, ones that blurred the line between theory and accusation. Several threads and videos proposed that Denver may have been pressured to accept the aircraft, even after expressing doubts. One post claimed he had tried to return the plane or push for modifications, but was met with resistance, possibly even legal threats over liability or contracts. Another theory alleged that the builder knew of the issues, but withheld information to protect their own name. Were these just conspiracy theories? Possibly. The internet has no shortage of wild speculation, especially when a beloved celebrity is involved. But here's what made these theories stick. No one came forward to dispute them. Not the builder, not the parts manufacturer, not the FAA. Silence, and again, became its own form of answer. And in that silence, new doubts took root. Because if Denver had voiced concern, if he had been aware of the plane's dangers, if others had known and failed to act, then this wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It was preventable. A chain of decision or inactions that led directly to one of the most devastating losses in music history. And just when it all seemed like it couldn't get murkier, the rumors took a chilling turn, shifting focus away from fuel systems and valves and toward Denver himself. As the years went by, the official reports faded, but the whispers only grew louder. The more time passed, the less the public seemed interested in what actually happened, and more obsessed with what might have happened. People began speculating that John Denver's life hadn't been as perfect as it looked, that behind the gentle voice and feel-good lyrics was a man quietly battling demons. Some even suggested that he boarded that plane knowing full well he wouldn't be coming back, that the crash was intentional. But the facts tell a very different story. The toxicology report was clear. No drugs, no alcohol, no medications that would impair his ability to fly. He was clean, completely sober at the time of the crash. Friends described him as energized in the weeks leading up to his death. He had recently been working on new music, environmental projects, and even spoken about returning to performing full-time. He just bought land. He was planning, dreaming, moving forward. Still, the rumors persisted. Some pointed to his history with DUI arrests, a detail tabloids latched onto in the aftermath of his death. It's true, Denver had faced legal trouble over alcohol years earlier. But by all accounts, he had worked hard to get clean. He had openly acknowledged those struggles, spoken about personal responsibility, and had reportedly stopped drinking altogether well before the crash. Others claimed he'd been dealing with emotional fallout from his divorce, or that he'd been isolated, even depressed. But again, the people closest to him disagreed. They described a man who had weathered life's storms and come out stronger, not immune to pain, but nowhere near the version the internet was crafting. Then there were the conspiracy theorists, those who took things several steps further. One theory suggested sabotage, that someone had tampered with the aircraft or knowingly left it in unsafe condition. Another proposed that Denver had enemies due to his outspoken political views, particularly his environmental activism, which had ruffled feathers in both industry and government circles. There was even a fringe claim that he had been silenced because of something he was about to reveal. Most of these theories fall apart under scrutiny. No credible evidence has ever emerged linking his crash to foul play. But once a mystery grabs hold of the internet, it becomes something else entirely. No longer about facts, but about feeling. And the feeling that stuck with people. Even after all the reports were closed, the lawsuits settled, and the headlines faded, was this: something about John Denver's death still doesn't sit right. He wasn't a reckless daredevil. He wasn't spiraling. He wasn't intoxicated or unstable. He was a seasoned pilot flying an unfamiliar aircraft with a flawed design, one that others had warned about. And that raises a haunting possibility, that this wasn't about self-destruction or conspiracy, but something much more frustrating. That a man died not because of malice or intent, but because a system full of silent dangers and overlooked warnings let him down. That's what makes the story so hard to shake. Because even with the facts lined up on paper, even with the experts chiming in, even with the official cause stamped and sealed, there's a gap between truth and closure, between what we know and what we feel. And that gap still echoes nearly 30 years later. John Denver's music offered something few artists ever could: a sense of peace, a kind of unshakable purity. His lyrics weren't about fame or wealth or ego. They were about nature, about stillness, about going home. He made people feel grounded, even if they were lost. His songs were the soundtrack to long drives, first loves, and quiet mornings. He gave the world beauty and asked for nothing in return. But the story of his death, it couldn't be more different. What began as a short afternoon flight turned into a decades-long enigma, filled with half-answers, quiet settlements, and questions that never quite got asked loudly enough. The official cause may have pointed to pilot error, but every layer beneath that told a different story. One of mechanical flaws, poor design, legal maneuvering, and a system that seemed more concerned with avoiding blame than facing hard truths. There was no public reckoning, no structural changes, no large-scale review of how experimental aircraft were certified or sold. Just quiet acknowledgments, sealed documents, and a lingering sense that something vital had been missed, or worse, ignored. And while some of the wilder conspiracy theories didn't hold up under scrutiny, the void they filled, the silence left by institutions and experts, made it easier for speculation to thrive. Because when those responsible for safety stay quiet, the public starts writing its own version of the story. And that version often tells us more than the official one ever could. Maybe the greatest tragedy here isn't just how John Denver died, but how his death was processed. How quickly it was swept into a folder, filed under accident, and left to gather dust. As if the man who gave the world so much beauty deserved only silence in return. It's a cruel irony. Here was a man who sang about truth, about honesty, about walking through life with your heart open. And yet the aftermath of his death felt like a masterclass in avoidance. Avoiding questions, avoiding responsibility, avoiding deeper reflection. And maybe that's why the mystery still lingers. Because we want to believe that when someone as good-hearted as John Denver is taken from the world, we at least owe it to him to tell the full story, to make sure no one else ends up in the same position, flying with false safety, trusting systems that fail behind the scenes. But in this case, that didn't happen. We may never know exactly what went wrong that day over the Pacific. We may never see the missing documents, or hear the closed-door conversations, or know what Denver was truly thinking in those final moments. But here's what we do know. John Denver deserved better, not just in the cockpit, but in the investigation, in the accountability, and in the legacy that followed. Because when the man who sang "All My Memories Gather Round Her" dies in silence, with no one willing to speak for him, that's not just a tragedy, it's a warning. If you thought this story was unsettling, wait until you hear what happened to another Hollywood legend whose final days were even more mysterious. Click here to uncover the truth they tried to erase. And don't forget to subscribe, because the stories you think you know, they're rarely the whole story.